So, welcome to the afternoon session of the Third International Conference on Respiratory Disease and Care. I'm Dr. Emanuel Goldman. I'm going to give the keynote address, and then right after, we'll immediately proceed into the afternoon session, which is potential indoor air treatments to prevent disease transmission. So my talk is entitled "The Mistaken Belief that Fomites Play a Significant Role in Transmission of Respiratory Diseases." Now, there have been a lot of careers that were built on fomites and the assertion that it could transmit respiratory diseases. It took a pandemic for us to start to take that down. The scientific community has long considered fomites significant vehicles for transmission of respiratory viruses. But the scientific basis was mostly survival of viable viruses on surfaces monitored over a period of time. The presence of virus genetic material on surfaces was also considered supporting evidence. And this was the conventional wisdom during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, as I'm sure everyone here knows, the causative agent of the COVID-19 is SARS-CoV-2. And in the case of SARS-CoV-2, the virus survival experiments were not representative of real-world conditions. Recovery of viral RNA was found, but that was misleading because the RNA quality was generally too poor to suggest live virus being present. Further, during the year when everyone was masked in the pandemic, influenza virtually disappeared. It was astonishing. And this is something that people have not paid enough attention to. The common cold, which is a respiratory illness, experiments 35 years ago show that fomites were not significantly involved in the transmission of the common cold. And as I'll go over later on in the talk, near the end of the talk, the data that said that rhinoviruses were transmitted by fomites included actual experiments where they were experimentally gave the common cold to someone by having them touch a surface and then touch their noses. That's in the literature. And yet, even in that case, with that kind of gold standard type of evidence, it's wrong. It's not the way it's done. It can happen, but very, very rarely. It's not the way it really is transmitted in real life. And for other respiratory viruses, the evidence is similarly weak. And that's the argument I'm going to be making today. But let's start with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. That's how I got into this. SARS and STARS are kind of similar in sound. Okay. And so I coined the term SARS Wars. But actually, I found on a Google search someone else had done that before anyway. There's nothing new under the sun. But, and the reason I called it a war was because we really had two camps here. We had people advocating fomites and people advocating aerosols. Now, the fomites people acknowledged that aerosols were also a part of it, but they thought fomites were a big part of it. So just to read you the slide here, if you haven't had a chance, and this was designed to look like the Star Wars intros in the movies. A long time ago on a continent far, far away, a new virus appeared, threatening life on Earth as we know it. As people worldwide scrambled to protect themselves from infection, competing narratives as to how the virus was transmitted emerged. Early in the pandemic, the fomites were ascendant, and everyone was advised to disinfect surfaces and be careful of what they touched. As more and more research results were obtained, the aerosols began to fight back. And this commentary today updates the current status of these wars. Well, the first movie in the Star Wars series is called The Phantom Menace, and I would label the fomites as the Phantom Menace. Here's where we began. March 29th, 2020, World Health Organization. Modes of transmission of virus causing COVID-19. Avoid touching surfaces. Clean surfaces regularly with standard disinfectants. CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. April 8th, 2020, early in the pandemic. Provide tissues, no-touch trash cans, hand soap, alcohol-based sanitizer containing at least 60% alcohol, disinfectants, disposable towels, and so on. And how did all this manifest? This was the public health advice to the people in the world. On the internet, March 30th, 2020. Here's how to clean your groceries during the COVID-19 outbreak. You know, and you have people putting bleach on lettuce. I mean, good grief. Well, that's where we were. What was all this based on? On a personal, anecdotal level, my mother-in-law was nagging me, clean the groceries, clean the mail, and it got on my nerves. And so I decided to look into what's the scientific basis for this. And what I found appalled me. The basis was flimsy, very, very flimsy. Some of it came from studies with the original SARS coronavirus, the one that caused the epidemic 2002, 2003, 2004. And now it's renamed SARS-CoV-1. So this paper said that you had 6 days survival of SARS on surfaces, but the experiments were done by placing 10 to the 7th, that's 10 million virus particles on the surface being tested. You do that and you wait 6 days on the surface of choice and you find some viruses left. Another paper 2 years even earlier that had a 4-day survival using 1 million infectious particles on the surface. Those were all with the original SARS coronavirus. With the new one, SARS-CoV-2, this paper was very influential. It came out of NIH. Aerosol and surface stability of SARS-CoV-2 is compared with SARS-CoV-1. It's published online in the middle of March 2020. And they found longer survival, up to 2 days on surfaces, 3 days in aerosols, generated in the laboratory. But again, they used a large inoculum. Now, this was a very influential paper in shaping the advice from public health experts, and has been very widely cited, enormous number of citations. One good thing they did in this paper is that they introduced the concept of half-life, that the virus decays with a predictable half-life depending on the surface. Now, most scientists, I certainly think of half-life as applying to radioactive decay. What half-life means is that in a certain interval of time, half of what was there is gone and half remains. And then you repeat that interval of time and half of what was left is gone and half of what was left remains, or a quarter, and then an eighth, and then a 16th, and so on ad infinitum until you get down to, in this case, less than 1 virus particle remaining on the surface. And so they published the half-lives of SARS-CoV-2 and SARS-CoV-1. And if you look on cardboard, they reported a half-life of 3 hours for SARS-CoV-2 on cardboard. And they started out with 10,000 particles. So it takes about 40 hours until you get less than 1 virus particle remaining. But if you had 50 particles instead of 10,000, you're rid of it in 17 hours. The original SARS virus, the one from 2002, 3, and 4, had a 1 hour half-life on cardboard. So even with 10,000 virus particles, it would be gone in half a day. So the take-home message from this slide is that the larger the inoculum, the longer the virus will survive on the surface. And that's because you have more half-lives to go through. until you get down to less than one virus particle left. So the question is, for these experiments to be relevant to real life, what is the proper inoculum size? Now, at the time I was doing my literature search, there really wasn't anything in the literature for SARS-CoV-2, and actually there still really isn't very much, I don't think. But there was data for flu. And for influenza virus, in aerosols, a droplet in the air was found to have between 10 and 100 virus particles by virtue of the viral RNA, the genetic material of the virus. The actual infectious virus particles in that droplet was even lower, less than 10. So one other, I thought, very important experiment that was ignored with the original SARS-CoV virus from 2002, 3, and 4. Dowell and coworkers did a very telling experiment. Instead of looking at artificially inoculated surfaces and seeing how long the virus survives, they went into an actual hospital ward and took smears from patients infected with SARS and put those smears on the surfaces in the room and then tested how much virus do they have on those smears. And you know what? They didn't find any live virus. All cultures showed no growth. They were a little confused by this result. They found the viral genetic material. Sorry, that's the wrong way here. They found the viral genetic material, but that means they did the experiment right. They actually got material from the patient that had virus in it and put it on the surface. But by the time it got to the surface and they measured that, what was left, nothing viable. No viable virus was left. So that's a big tip-off. So this experiment plus my analysis of the numbers, the numerology, led me to publish this paper in The Lancet. It's actually probably the main reason I'm standing here before you today. Exaggerated risk of transmission of COVID-19 by fomites. I actually sent this paper off to The Lancet on Star Wars Day, May the 4th, 2020. May the 4th be with you. And I didn't hear anything from The Lancet for 6 weeks, 7 weeks. I figured, oh, they're just not even going to bother to reject it. They're just not even going to tell me. So I'm thinking, well, who else should I send it to? And by the way, I first sent it to the New England Journal of Medicine, which published that other paper that I told you about, where they measured survival on the surfaces. But then I got a surprise email from The Lancet saying we're going to publish it. And they worked very hard with me to make sure all my numbers were 100% correct. And it was published. And that led to some attention. The press, the end of July, The Atlantic, a reporter named Derek Thompson, coined a term hygiene theater that's become relatively famous in and of itself. And that came in an interview that he had with me. And I pointed out to him, in order to get the amount of virus on a surface that people are saying leads to survival, you'd need as many as 100 people coughing or sneezing on the surface at the same time to replicate that. And as I said to Derek Thompson, those studies stack the deck to get a result that bears no resemblance to the real world. So a fair amount of press followed. Another really good story came out of Wired.com, a reporter named Gregory Barber, and he reinforced that. Finally, in February of 2021, Nature came around as well. They published a news feature, COVID-19 rarely spreads through surfaces, why are we still deep cleaning? And they published an editorial. Coronavirus is in the air, there's too much focus on surfaces. And they cited my Lancet paper and called upon public health authorities to stop emphasizing surfaces and talk about the air. And 2 months later, the CDC finally agreed. They changed their guidance and they said that the infection via fomite transmission route is low, generally less than 1 in 10,000. I think that's a very conservative estimate. I say it's less than 1 in a million. But that's, as the popular phrase goes, that it is what it is. And that's where we stood at this point. So, can I sit down now? My lecture over? Are we done? Unfortunately, not, because the fomites struck back. Bunch of papers. Paper out of Australia. 28 days survival of infectious SARS-CoV-2 in subsurfaces. Headlines around the world. October of 2020. Review article. Uncovers the high potential for SARS-CoV-2 transmission through contaminated surfaces. November 2020. And the Chinese chipped in as well. They isolated infectious SARS-CoV virus from imported frozen cod packaging at their seaport. Now, they didn't find any in the supermarkets. They didn't find any when they looked downstream, but they were able to get it out of frozen packaging when it arrived. And I don't even have a slide in it, but people modeled like the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which had a SARS outbreak, and they said in their modeling, 30% of the infections were caused by fomites. That's not the majority, but that's certainly not non-negligible. It's a lot of infections if that were true. So why are these studies wrong? Well, first, as I said before, the inoculums used were orders of magnitude too large. Also, the levels of virus found in samples, community samples, were determined by viral RNA and not by looking at infectious virus. And the viral RNA, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, tends to be very poor quality. The viral RNA is detected by a process called a polymerase chain reaction, PCR. And the better the quality of the virus, the fewer the cycles of PCR that you need to get a signal. And typically 20 or so, 20, 25 cycles maybe. You get up to 30 cycles or more of PCR, your viral RNA quality is poor. And that's what all these studies had. So viral RNA is not a valid surrogate for the presence of the virus. But going back to the kind of experiment that Dowell and coworkers did with the original SARS virus, if you actually go into hospitals again, this was done in Italy, it was done in Israel. Again, no live virus was found. And in community settings, again, no live virus, and also poor quality RNA. And here's another one. I was involved in this study. Surfaces are not relevant sources for transmission. Now, there's another factor here. I told you before about half-lives, and you need more half-lives to go through. Turns out even worse than that in terms of being an artifact. Another completely overlooked finding from the original SARS virus was that the survival on surfaces increases at the higher initial virus concentrations, but not just because there's more virus, but the virus protects itself from decay. So it's not only that you have more half-lives to go through, but you also extend the half-lives at the higher concentrations. So the half-lives no longer become a valid parameter. This is a paper with the original SARS virus. Look at the inoculums here. You've got 10 to the 4th, 10 to the 5th, 10 to the 6th. With 10 to the 4th, that's 10,000. On paper, it was gone in 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes. But if you do 1 million, it took 24 hours to get rid of it. Also, they used disposable gowns and cotton gowns. So I also directed experiments in my lab to ask the same question using a surrogate for SARS-CoV-2, a non-pathogenic surrogate a virus called V6. It's an envelope virus, just like SARS is an envelope virus. And we found the same thing. If you have, in fact, no time, you just dry it and immediately look to see how much viable virus you have. You get 93% recovered if you start out with as little as 5,600. But if you cut down to 60, you've only got 2% recovered. You can see the same pattern throughout all of these times. There's 15 minutes drying, 30 minutes drying, 60 minutes drying. In every case, the most survival is with the highest inoculum, and the half-life is much bigger with the highest inoculum. The half-life decreases as you decrease the inoculum. So the half-life is not fixed. It's a function of virus concentration. Another reason why all those experiments are just wrong. They're basically artifacts. Now, what about that Australian study? 28 days, right? Well, they did that under optimal humidity and temperature, where humidity and temperature are variables and the virus is killed when it's dried out. They also kept the samples in the dark. The virus is killed by ultraviolet light. In sunlight, it's gone very quickly, but I think even any source of light, and physicists may be able to correct me, but I think any source of light has some ultraviolet in it. And that kills the virus. Also, the Australian study used bovine serum albumin mixed in with their SARS-CoV-2 samples. Well, that was already published, that protects the virus from environmental decay. And we actually saw something like that in our experiments too, not shown in the slide, but if we added LB medium, which contains tryptone broth, which is a high protein containing broth, then we could eliminate the differences at the different concentrations. So it's another source of manipulation of the results. Mucus is a hostile environment for virus survivals, and so the samples from mucus are less likely to have virus. And if you look in mucus, you have about a 3-hour half-life. Now, what about this Chinese report of live virus from frozen cod packaging? So that is maybe the most persuasive argument for the possible importance of fomite transmission. But for most of us in the real world, we're not going to deal with imported frozen packaging directly on receipt of the shipment. And when you go downstream, even to the supermarkets, no live virus was found. So yeah, if you want to get fomite transmission, if you work hard at it, you might be able to do it. And I'll actually show you an example of that later in the lecture, where that was actually documented. It can happen, but it doesn't happen very much in the real world. There was a case in South Korea where a building with over 1,000 occupants, call center in that building, I guess that's a place where people call us and ask us if we want to buy auto insurance or something like that. They had an outbreak of COVID-19, and everybody in the call center got it, but almost nobody else in the building got it. And if fomites were a significant source of transmission, you wouldn't have seen that. Other people in the buildings would have gotten it. You have to work hard to inoculate yourself with SARS-CoV-2. Here's a case where someone really worked hard. Thought to be only one reported transmission through contaminated surface by what's termed the, snot-oral route. According to the report, a person with COVID-19 in China blew his nose with his hand and then pressed a button in his apartment building elevator. A second resident in the building then touched the same button and flossed his teeth with a toothpick. Immediately thereafter, transferring the virus from the elevator button to his mouth. So, yeah, you can get it. You can get it by fomites. But if you're dumb, if you don't wash your hands, if you work real hard at it. Now, I promised you before I talk a little bit about rhinoviruses. So published experiments had demonstrated that you could get an infection through fomites. You put rhinovirus, a large concentration on a surface, have a volunteer touch the surface, touch their noses, and they get the cold. But is that relevant to real-world conditions? And so a tremendous experiment was published in 1987. In this experiment, two groups of men, healthy volunteers and volunteers who were infected with rhinovirus, sick with the rhinovirus, they played poker for about 12 hours, long poker game. So one had the common cold, the other group was healthy. Now the healthy group were restrained so they couldn't touch their faces, their eyes, their nose, or their mouths during this poker game. But the cards and the chips from the game were fully exposed to the people who were sick, coughing, sneezing all over the place. And also the healthy volunteers who couldn't touch their faces. Then these experimenters took the contaminated cards and chips and put it in another room with all healthy volunteers and had them play poker with those cards and chips and told those healthy volunteers to touch their faces, their mouths, their eyes, their noses. And the result of this experiment is that the healthy volunteers who couldn't touch their eyes, nose, and faces, but were in the same room with the sick volunteers, they got sick. But the healthy volunteers that only had the fomites, the cards and the chips that were contaminated, they didn't get sick. There's no reason to expect that SARS-CoV-2, and now I would add to that any respiratory virus, would behave differently. And if anything, the enveloped coronaviruses are even more fragile than the cold virus, the rhinovirus, which is not an enveloped virus. On the other hand, there is good evidence for airborne transmission of SARS-CoV-2. Former colleague of mine, Kevin Fennelly, published an article about the infectious aerosols and the different particle sizes, and actually viable SARS-CoV-2, infectious SARS-CoV-2 was isolated in the air of a hospital room with COVID-19 patients. This got out of order here. Well, let's go back. So let's look at human respiratory viruses. Here's a table from a review article in 2021, last year. SARS-CoV-2 is going to be in this column of human coronavirus. Here's influenza, measles, RSV now in the news. And here's a herpes virus, that's a DNA virus. Here's the common cold, the rhinovirus, and another DNA virus, human adenovirus. Let's look at the rhinovirus. Is it infectious on surfaces? Yes, virus genetic material, all of these things check, including transmission in a laboratory environment. And yet the experiment, when you actually do it with patients, shows that you don't get transmission. Here's for the coronavirus. You've got just primarily, for most of these, this is where the evidence is. Infectious virus survival on experimentally contaminated surfaces. That's where the evidence is. And that's not good enough because of the way those experiments are done. It's just too much virus. So many scientists get it. In the journal Science in 2021, a major article appeared, Airborne Transmission of Respiratory Viruses. What they argue in this article is for transmission by the air, but what they don't do is eliminate fomites as a source. Okay, so they're arguing for airborne transmission. And that's also over here. And this paper, also in Science a couple of months earlier than that, that was primarily concerned with ventilation. So they were talking about the way to control respiratory infections is through ventilation. We're going to hear a talk in the next session about ventilation and other treatments for respiratory infection. And that leads me to my last slide, which is also title of another one of the Star Wars movies, A New Hope. We just published a couple of months ago in the Journal of Infectious Diseases. The next frontier is indoor air treatment. This paper is titled Triethylene Glycol Can Be Pre-Deployed as a Safe Virus-Killing Indoor Air Treatment. And several of the authors are here. And this particular reagent, triethylene glycol, is used in a product called Grignard Pure. A disclosure, I am an unpaid scientific advisor to the Grignard Pure company, but it contains TEG. It's non-toxic, FDA approved in the air, and it's been safely used for years in the theater and in air fresheners. And so it is my hope that we can see our way out of this pandemic and future pandemics with air treatments. And the next session immediately following this talk will be describing a lot of this. Okay, I'm within time here. Summary. Transmission of SARS-CoV-2 by fomites in the pandemic has been virtually negligible. It's a virus you catch almost exclusively by breathing and not by touching. The design of laboratory experiments showing long-term survival of SARS-CoV-2 on fomites render those results irrelevant for real-life scenarios. Now, I'm not denying the possibility of transmission by surfaces. However, our thinking should consider surface transmission as no more than a minor component of COVID-19 infections. And to transmit by a surface, you need a fresh contamination, you need to touch it, you need to not wash your hands, and then you have to touch your face. And then you might be able to transmit it to yourself. And even that is limited because the efficiency of transfer of virus from fingers is not very good. It's about 15%. That's been measured. And there's also some evidence that if your fingers are virucidal, virus will die on your fingers. So even with all that, it's still going to be difficult to self-inoculate. It's a terrible waste to continue expensive, time-consuming, and potentially dangerous surface disinfection procedures beyond normal routine hygiene. I'm not saying don't do normal routine hygiene. You should always be washing your hands, but not because of COVID, for many reasons, many other reasons. If you don't have soap and water handy, you can use an alcohol wipe. The virus will be killed by that. The lessons we learned from SARS-CoV-2 are likely to apply to most, if not all, other respiratory viruses. We already know that influenza and rhinoviruses for the common cold are likewise almost exclusively transmitted by breathing and not by fomites. And finally, treatment of indoor air by safe virus-killing reagents such as triethylene glycol will be an important addition to our ability to combat this and future pandemics. I want to thank you all for your attention. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to see what I can do to answer those.
Time for questions?
We've got about 4 minutes for questions.
So, Matt, I had a question about the study you showed survival on different hospital counts. One was synthetic, one was natural, and there was a big difference. Why was there such a difference?
Well, that's okay. So the question is about why was there such a difference in the survival of hospital gowns? Are you talking about hospital gowns versus paper or the amount of vernacular?
It's gowns versus paper.
What's that?
Gowns versus
paper. Probably because the hospital gowns are more porous than paper, and so maybe the virus is supposed to hide in it.
So it could be the effect of recovery, not necessarily survival. Just the sample was not recovered.
On the cotton gowns, but on the paper it's very clear that the virus concentration was doubly impacted. When you do 10 to the 6th virus, you have a 24-hour survival. 10 to the 4th virus, you have 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes. And even though on the cotton gowns and the other surfaces, may have had differential survival because of the porosity, but still, you still, on top of that, have a difference between 10 to the 6 and 10 to the 4. They're not good.
Why would porosity allow the virus to survive longer?
How about
Why would porosity?
porosity? Can hide, maybe?
So I think it's not the effect of porosity, it's the ability to recover the virus. It's much,
Oh, maybe not, that's true.
it's
Maybe
much
just-
harder to recover from porous surface.
Maybe just being able to access it. Yeah.
To investigate the surface, survival surface, then it should be either glass or stainless steel or plastic, something that's completely non-porous. Because otherwise you're losing that material, virus material to the surface. Unless we really have a good recovery technique.
Other questions? Yes.
It's kind of a two-part question. Why do you think that the bias towards termites has survived, right, scientifically? And the second part of the question is, do you see any type of parallel between this type of belief in termites, for example, as a way of transmitting a virus, versus, for example, in the 1980s, HIV, with the lack of understanding about transmissibility and how transmission occurs, and intrinsic biases that come out of those mistaken beliefs?
Yeah, I think your last point about HIV is very well taken. We're actually going to hear, I think, the first talk after in the session that will follow talks about public health measures and perceptions on why do people still fight for fomites? Well, fomites are not innocuous, and you can still get food poisoning. You can get staphylococcus. You get from chicken carcasses.
Right. So enteric viruses.
So, yeah, so those are bacteria, not viruses.
Okay. Yeah.
But there are also some viruses that appear to be transmitted by fomites. I believe the norovirus, another one, that's a gastrointestinal infection. Poliovirus is a gastrointestinal disease. I don't know if there's any evidence for fomite transmission of it, but
No.
you get it into your mouth and you get it. So there is reason to maintain hygiene. I never said don't hand wash,
Right.
but you've got to protect what you breathe for something like SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, and other respiratory infections. That's really the take-home message. And people also make careers on this, and they have a vested interest.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to try to publish an article based on what I just talked to everybody here. I think I'm going to have a hard time with that. Because there's going to be some reviewers are going to just absolutely say, no, this is wrong. Be willing to let it go. Any other? Okay, so
Okay.
we're good.
Manny.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's get back to, let's get the first, get the next one on, which is going to be Brian Regan, a story about chemical science and public health. Brian, let me introduce you.
This is Don?
Hmm?
This is Don?
Brian, what's his name?
Brian Regan. It says
Of the billions of dollars.
BTR. That should be it. Yeah. Is the one right? No, that's not it.
Down to the CDC and the environmental saving Canada.
It's huge, yeah. You mean?
That's what I emailed you about an hour ago. That's it. That's it. Yeah.
So while
Can I
we're
just-
getting our slides up here,
Can I come? Yeah. Can you put it in?
introduce the second of the session.
Right.
Title of the session is Potential Indoor Air
Is that
Treatment.
but in to present?
Segues very nicely from the end of my talk.
Where's present mode?
And
Okay.
we're going to start. It's Brian Regan from the Grignard Tour Company, He's going to tell us a story about
Present mode, so.
science and
You
public
can
health.
type there, you can get it. No, no.
And I guess.
In
story.
present mode, so. Can you get out of that? Yeah. Can you put it on slideshow, in slideshow? So go back to. Yeah,
Use
and then
this.
go to slideshow. You can just do the arrow. But no, but it's